Hello, I'm Laura Baker, Associate Client Portfolio Manager here at Pender, and today we are joined by Admiral Mark Norman, who retired from the Royal Canadian Navy in the rank of Vice Admiral in 2019 after over 39 years of service. Admiral Norman has had a distinguished military career and is widely regarded as one of Canada's leading voices on national security, defense strategy, and geopolitical risk. Since retirement, he has remained deeply engaged in Canada's defense and security landscape, contributing actively to national security discussions through his work with the Global Affairs Institute and as a member of the Conference of Defense Associations Board. Today, we'll be exploring the Canadian defense landscape, the strategic importance of the Arctic, and the broader geopolitical themes shaping the world today, including why they matter not only for policymakers, but also investors navigating an increasingly complex global environment.
This podcast is for information purposes only. It should not be viewed as investment advice or as an offer to buy or sell Pender's funds. Our funds are not guaranteed, and any discussion of past performance is not an indicator of future results. Any opinions expressed are as of the date of this podcast and are subject to change. Pender may not necessarily share the opinions of our podcast guests. More important information can be found on our website, penderfund.com/disclaimer.
So Admiral Norman, thank you for joining us and welcome to the Pender Podcast. I know we just went through your official version of your career, but maybe a little bit less formally. When people ask you, what do you do? How do you like to answer that?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you. It's almost, as you get older, bios and introductions always get, they're embarrassing and very humbling. So I grew up in Kingston, Ontario. I was looking for a paying summer job in between grade 12 and 13, back when we had grade 13. I had been sailing for a few years. I was a sailing instructor, but I wasn't really getting paid to do that. And the Naval Reserve in Kingston was hiring for the summer. And I said, hey, that looks kind of fun. And a couple of friends that I knew indirectly were also thinking of doing it. And so I gave that a try. And literally the next thing you know, I'm doing a full-time Navy job. What do I do now? Well, now I leverage, to use a business term, all of that amazing experience and knowledge that I developed through my career to help a variety of organizations, as you mentioned. I help influence, I hope, the defense debate and the different narratives and policy discussions in Canada. I help companies navigate the processes of trying to be part of this massive defense ecosystem that exists and is growing.
Maybe just to kick things off, based on the conversations you've been having, where would you say Canada stands from a defense perspective? Like what's working well, maybe some gaps that have come up?
Yeah, okay. So, all right, let me kind of put this in sort of three buckets, if I can. Bucket number one is where the institution currently is. Bucket number two is more the geostrategic situation. And then bucket number three is what I would characterize as domestic Canadian policy commitment and budget and that kind of stuff. Okay, so as it relates to the institution, the Canadian Armed Forces is in, I'm not overstating, it's in pretty rough shape. Over the preceding 2 or 3 decades, it suffered a number of challenges that primarily relate to decreased funding over time. And as a result of that, sort of, I'm going to say, a lot less appreciation, respect, and support in non-financial terms than it probably should have had. So the net result, Laura, is that the organization is understaffed. It has a lot of old equipment that needs to be replaced. It has hollowed out many of its sort of background business processes and the like, spare parts, maintenance, all these types of things, and as a result of that, they have kind of a compounding effect. If people want to join, they want to join an organization that is vibrant and exciting, and it's seen to be important to not just them but to fellow Canadians. And so this, as we're trying to correct all of these problems, the good news is we're starting to go in the right direction. The bad news is that we still have all of the baggage, if I can put it that way, of the preceding couple of decades. Now, as far as the macro sort of geostrategic situation is concerned, Canada's always been very fortunate that we've had this incredibly constructive and arguably unrivaled relationship with the United States. Integrated defense, integrated economics, and that's really served Canada well from a purely Canadian perspective. So we have always been, and just given population and economic strength, we've always been sort of the smaller of the two partners. But there's always been a relationship of mutual respect, and we did things that the Americans didn't, vice versa, and we worked really well together. From a defense and security perspective, that has meant that, to be blunt, we've gotten away with decades and decades of underinvestment because we didn't really have to, because the Americans would, even though they didn't like it, they were very nice about it and very friendly, but they would sort of backfill behind us, and if we had problems, they would compensate for them, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that has come to a very abrupt end, probably for good, not for good reasons, but it's probably a good thing for us. It has, and we need to separate why this is happening from why it's a good thing, in my opinion. We can scratch on that deeper if you want. And then the third component of this is, where are we headed? And this is kind of the most optimistic bucket of the three that I'm describing, where I see Canadians increasingly understanding that we have an obligation, not just for our own security in terms of physical security of Canada and hemispheric security in partnership with the United States, even though there's lots of political challenges at the moment. But more broadly, a lot of the things that we would aspire to, as it relates to what makes us Canadian, are under threat globally. And so there's a sense of things have kind of come off the rails a little here. We need to up our game, and there seems to be a sense that is defense spending as part of that is more supported than it was before. It's never going to be 100%, and that's understandable. And it's always going to be a challenge for government because there's other priorities on a day-to-day and month-to-month basis. But we have a government that is fully committed to fixing the armed forces. We have a government that has stepped up to meet its international obligations with respect to the expectations of being part of the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Alliance. And now the problem is that in order to fix all this, these are massive investments that are required. And the pace at which we have to move this money responsibly, and that's a key thing to discuss, is quite staggering. And so that's kind of a long overview of where we find ourselves in just coming up to the end of 2025.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. It's from something that almost barely came up a few years ago, even with like the rise of ESG investing to now defense being so top of mind. It's been good to see. And especially as we diverge from our neighbors to the south, the Department of War, just to see how we are going to adapt. I guess my question would be, if we were to see that more consistent, targeted defense investment more broadly, how would you see that impacting Canada's industrial base or just our innovation ecosystem?
Yeah, excellent. And I think, this is for your listeners and your viewers and your colleagues. This is really where it gets interesting. I mean, of course, I'm a bit of a nerd about some of this stuff. The policy side of it is all very interesting, but at the end of the day, this is where, as the saying, follow the money. Okay, so again, a couple of layers to your question. The first is, let's just talk about the sheer scale of this. So, when I left the military about 6 years ago, I was basically, from a business perspective, I was the chief operating officer of the organization. Okay, I had a boss who looked after other things, but I was managing the business of the armed forces in many respects, and so we were moving around. Let's say, for sake of argument, in the mid high 20 billion a year range. The budget for 2025, 2026 for defense is over $60 billion. Now, first of all, that's a staggering amount of money, but it also speaks to how quickly things have turned around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a lot of money. And it goes into a lot of different parts of the business, and I won't bore you and your listeners, but you can just imagine it's a very complicated organization with lots of moving parts. But now let's put the money in context. A lot of that goes to human resource costs. There's a lot of fixed costs in there. You're managing massive infrastructure, all sorts of things. But one of the expectations of NATO, which I mentioned earlier, which we are a founding member of, and this is part of where the pressure, the external pressure, is coming from to up our game, so to speak, is not just that we need a target, which is a percentage of our GDP, which is pretty much, it's a formula, but also that we increase the percentage of that spend that is going into new capital. So you can imagine, from a business perspective, if you don't have the people to do what you need to do, that's one problem. If you're not investing in the capital, which allows the people to do what they're going to do, and arguably allows them to do it more efficiently, then you've got a large workforce which is not properly capitalized to do what's required. So this is part of the reason why this is a huge problem. And the target is that we spend 25% on capital. So you start to unpack all this. Now you're looking at, let's just do the simple math. We need to move about 15 billion a year in today's dollars, which is going to go up, based on inflation and a potential increase in the expectation of NATO on new capital. Now that's equipment, that's infrastructure. There's other elements of that, but I mean, your listeners understand the difference between operating costs, human capital, salary, overhead, all that kind of stuff, and physical capital. So this is where the challenge is in order to move the money, but also this is where the opportunity space is. And so as we look at what kinds of capital investments are required, the traditionally we tend to focus on what I call the big shiny objects, okay? And airplanes, ships, submarines, tanks, whatever. But there's so much more to it. I mean, that's the stuff people see because they can get their heads around it. But there's also so much going on behind the scenes, and that includes technology and a lot of not just emerging technologies, but trends we're seeing Unfortunately, we're seeing play out in some of the the combat that's going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East and elsewhere. We're seeing, a significant shift in the use of technology. Historically, there's always been a similar shift in the use of technology. It's just been different, and so now the 21st century version of that is seeing, the incorporation of all of these things which are in our day-to-day lives. We're seeing autonomous capabilities in robotics. We're seeing AI and quantum computing. We're seeing remote sensing. We're seeing a whole variety of technologies that have what is characterized in simple terms as dual or multi-use technology. It's not just exclusively the domain of the military. There are still traditionally a bunch of military things that need to be done. We're seeing the increased use of space, where all of these things, which are as much a commercial interest as they are a military interest. So to wrap up my response to your question, where the opportunities lie is in either participating in the purchasing of these big shiny objects, which is, there's definitely opportunity there, especially in some of the manufacturing and equipment sectors and things like that. But more importantly, in the emerging technology sectors, this is where the dual use is becoming extremely attractive and potentially lucrative. And the last part of that is, well, what about Canada? So this is where I go back to what I said. There's some hidden advantages in being called out and having to increase our investment and our strained relationship with the United States, because now, we're pursuing two concurrent offsets. One is we're looking very seriously at what we can do at home ourselves, and we can talk about that. And that is a huge opportunity for Canadian industry and for Canadian cap. Now I'm talking about, when I talk about capital, now I'm talking about money flowing to pursue those opportunities. And then the second part of that is new markets, both either as suppliers of things that we need, but as the Prime Minister and government is telling us, not just being consumers, but actually being partners in these new relationships to try and offset this unhealthy dependence. And it was an unhealthy dependence on the United States in our economy in general, but specifically as it related to military spending. So it's a great question. The answer is multi-layered, and any one of those things we can scratch on more deeply if you want.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's really helpful. I know you're really speaking our language at Pender, of just that intersection between technology and those geopolitical risks. And I know like some of our portfolio companies definitely kind of fall within that space of exposure to defense, but also technologies that are utilized in other capacities as well. I kind of wanted to maybe talk about those big shiny objects a little bit. I know something that has come up quite a bit in the news is just the idea of procurement and how complex that system is. I guess in your perspective, what do you think the structural issues are, and how would be the best way to sort of increase the speed and transparency there for better outcomes?
Wow. Okay. Again, I'll try and do this as simply as I can, not because anybody is simple understanding it. It's just that it's just so complicated, and we could spend hours talking about it. But look, okay, so fundamentally, there are probably 3 to 5 major I'm going to call them obstacles or obstructions. And all of them can be overcome. They are all self-generated inside the machinery of government, the decision-making, policies, and all these kinds of things. But in very simple terms, the challenges we have historically had with procurement are a product of a number of factors. But let's just start with defining the requirement. So either because something needs to be replaced, or you need to do a new thing that you didn't used to be able to do, or because the threat environment has changed, you need something new. I always joke about cars. You need a new car. Why? Because the family got bigger, or the old one isn't working, or whatever the requirement is. So you start with a requirement, and there's a whole bunch of problems there, and a lot of those are embedded into the culture of the military with respect to the fact that when you only replace your car every 35 or 40 years, you're very protective of what that car will or won't be able to do, and you want to build in as much flexibility as you can through the life of owning that thing. You can imagine the complexity of all of this, especially when you overlay all the emerging technologies that we were talking about earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to figure out what it is.
Pretty big checks too.
Right, exactly. So then you got to figure out what you need, and then you got to figure out how much that's going to possibly cost. But you can't make any commitments to anybody yet because you're not allowed. So you've gone out, you've checked out, what was on the marketplace when you started the process, but now you fast forward 5-7 years, and now all of a sudden everything's changed, and now somebody has a new thing that might be, well, hang on a second, that might actually be the right answer. Then we layer on top of that politics, and then we don't think we should be doing this because that's not who we are. Party X versus Party Y, that then becomes a problem. You can just imagine the layers and layers and layers of this. And ultimately what we have is things take way too long to purchase. And part of it has to do with this iterative nature because everything takes so long. But you can just imagine if you're paying people time and materials to build your house, what's the incentive for them to build the house quickly? Well, there isn't one. And so these things drag out. So look, there's a lot going on there. There's too many people involved in the process. It takes way too long. The contracting mechanisms we have are inefficient, and they don't act in the best interest of taxpayers, although people will claim they do. Look, there's a lot in there, but that's kind of a high-level overview of where the problems are. So how do we fix this? Well, we're already starting to fix it. We're already seeing some really positive indicators. We've created, for the first time in my memory since, and I wasn't around then, I'm old, but I'm not that old, the Second World War, we have an agency that is specifically dedicated to defense investment. And that is being run by a private sector executive who is just getting started, and they're just standing up this new organization. It'll take a while to get it up and running. But this is a huge step forward. And a lot of what is intended there is to break down many of these things that I was just describing in my response, and to get the timeline shorter, make the process simpler, and give better value for taxpayers, while at the same time, the other priority for 2025 is to incentivize Canadian industry to be part of these big acquisitions, and not just the big shiny ones, but also a lot of the other ones where we have not done. And this is one of my I'm very passionate about. We have done a really crappy job of incentivizing real, genuine Canadian participation in our defense investments, and that is changing, and that goes back to this opportunity that we described earlier, or we quantified earlier, at roughly $15 billion a year and growing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It seems that especially seems to be changing a bit, just even investor interest, lending interest for the defense space. The tide seems to be turning.
And there's some mechanisms that are being put in place that I think is really, really interesting and also very reassuring. We now have a large sort of a banking lending resource that's been created under BDC that I think is very encouraging. We're going to see the government rolling out a new defense industrial strategy, which is going to describe in detail where the government wants to make the investments in what types of technologies, what areas of defense industry. We have a number of private sector venture capital entities that are now identifying and protecting some funding to pursue opportunities in the defense and security space. So this is all kind of coming together in a very, very positive and constructive way. But right at the moment, people are waiting for government to show them the rest of the signals, and those signals are not yet clear.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. One of the areas I know that you've spoken about being a major priority for Canada is the Arctic and our investment there. Maybe could you go over why this is such a critically important area for our defense strategy?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, let me start with asking your listeners, as they're watching this, to open their preferred browser and search for polar projection map Arctic shipping routes. And they should see a variation of a series of images that will completely reset what I hope is the context for our conversation. When we look at Canada, we tend to do it from an extremely southern perspective, which is understandable. I mean, 90% of our population lives within a couple hundred kilometers of the U.S. border. The rest of our landmass is mostly uninhabited and hard for people to get their heads around. But when you look at it from a polar projection, you see a few things. The first thing you see is at the center of it is a big ocean that is solid for part of the year, but it is fundamentally an ocean. The second thing you'll see is that we're surrounded on most of our sides by friends, but we have one not so friendly neighbor right across the street, if I can put it that way. And there's a lot going on there, and obviously that's Russia, and there's huge issues with respect to Russia's ambitions, geostrategically, militarily. And look, I am not a proponent of the boogeyman theory of national security here, but there are real concerns about what Russia is doing, especially in the Arctic. And then the other thing I would describe is when I look at this, so I'm a naval officer, land is an obstacle to be avoided in our business. But at the end of the day, when you look at this, you look at it from the reason I said the shipping routes is there's basically three ways through the Arctic from a maritime perspective. And we remind ourselves, look, this is an ocean, and it's a navigable ocean for part of the year. And as we look at climate change and all of those impacts, it's becoming increasingly accessible and increasingly navigable. There are three sort of routes through the Arctic. There's the northern route, or AKA the Russian route, which kind of goes along their coastline. There is the polar route, which is what I call the Trans-Canada Highway of the Arctic, which is a 8-lane superhighway that goes literally right through the middle. And then there is the romanticized Northwest Passage, which is through the Canadian archipelago. And then what I think a lot of your viewers and listeners will notice if they look at this, if they've never looked at it before, is a lot of our Arctic is islands of various sizes, and it's an archipelago, and it's really shallow and it's difficult to navigate, but it's also full of good stuff, minerals, critical minerals, oil, gas, iron ore, a lot of stuff up there. And
all
so
the most topical things right now.
Right, exactly. Oh, and by the way, if you look at Ontario's Ring of Fire, which is associated with the Canadian Shield and other, geographic elements and like that, the shortest way to get that stuff out is actually by taking it out through Hudson's Bay, which most people wouldn't even think of. They say, well, we build a highway, we'll bring it down, and we'll drive it through, Northern Ontario, blah, 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 and take it where? It's got to get somewhere to be useful. And so this is part of the thing, is when you start to look at, so we'll just pause the Arctic conversation and now put it in a broader context. We have all of this stuff that we need and other people want, and it's, for the most part, landlocked. So how do you get it out and get it to the markets that we want to get it to if we're not going to use it ourselves? This has to do with access to salt water. And so there's a variety of different things that are at play here. Go back to the Arctic now and put it in the context of all the increasing demand for these things, these commodities that are strategically important, not just to us, but to our friends and our potential, I'll call them potential enemies or non-friends. And this plays into the whole issue around the Arctic. And because it has been, I won't say ignored, we've had this emotional connection to the Arctic for decades, but we've not really translated it into what I would call a practical view. And as a result of that, we don't have enough infrastructure. We don't have enough capacity to do proper surveillance. We don't know what's going on in our own backyard, both in the air, on the water, on the land, or under the water. All of these things are huge vulnerabilities. We make legitimate claims to this being our North, and it is. But if we're not actually making the necessary investments to ensure that A, we know what's going on up there, and B, we can do something about it, then these are just hollow claims. And so this is why this is so important. And when you start to look at the evolution of the shipping thing, this is going to increase the volume of traffic. You can see countries like China starting to explore the Arctic. They say they're doing it for scientific purposes, which is complete crap. They're not. They're doing it for future exploitation purposes. These are big vulnerabilities for us, and it's another area where we need to catch up. And this is where it's not just about throwing money at the problem. Yes, that is a huge part of this, but we've got to develop the right technologies or use technologies which we can exploit and leverage, and we need to build the right partnerships. And that includes partnerships not just with the northern communities themselves, but also with pre-existing commercial operators. The military has many cultural biases, and one of them is that it thinks it needs to own everything that it does. And so, if you have a mine that's operating in Baffin Island 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and its port is open 12 months of the year because it has to be in order to continue to deliver the ore to the global market to make it a viable operation, then why is that not useful infrastructure that you could partner with the company? And I'm just using that as an example. And there's lots of other examples up there with respect to mining, commercial activities and things like that. And we just need to be smarter so that we're getting better value out of the taxpayers' money as we make these decisions. So
No, that was really helpful, and that's probably a really good place to wrap up, just with that intersection between investment and technology and curiosity as we move forward with just general spending within the defense sector. Before we wrap up, though, we do have one final question that we like to ask all of our guests. That's a lot lighter. So is there a book or a piece of media that's related to defense or otherwise that you have read or consumed recently that you'd like to recommend to the audience?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you two plugs
Perfect.
for unsolicited advertising. The first one is, in my introduction, you connected me legitimately as a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So I would commend to your listeners and viewers that they go look them up. That organization has its roots actually in the oil and gas industry, and that has branched out and now is actively engaged in thought leadership in the defense and security sector. And they do some amazing work on everything associated with defense policy, procurement, and all those things. And so if your viewers are interested in learning more, that would be my first recommendation. Canadian Global Affairs Institute, CGAI. And then the second plug, a few months ago, I was invited by the team at the Financial Post to start writing an irregular column. And so I've now written a few articles in the Financial Post on defense industry and some of the issues that we've been discussing. And so I don't get paid for that, so there's no conflict here. But if people like some of the things I'm saying or how I'm explaining things, then go check that out at the Financial Post. There you go. There's two things that might be helpful.
Great. No, I'm definitely will add that to my reading list. So just to wrap up, Admiral Norman, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your perspective. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I know I definitely learned a lot. The defense sector is an important theme within Pender's equity investing approach. So, listeners, if you'd like to hear more about how we think about these opportunities, we have actually published a white paper on this topic, which you can download on our website. And for listeners who want more insights and updates from the Pender investment team, please visit penderfund.com, where you'll find commentary, research, and past episodes of the Pender Podcast. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for listening. Until next time, I'm Laura Baker, and this is the Pender Podcast.
Pender is an independent, employee-owned investment firm located in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our goal is to protect and grow wealth for our investors over time. To achieve this, we seek to understand the quality of a business or security, obtain more value than we are paying for, deploy capital in flexible mandates, and mitigate downside risk. We have a talented investment team of expert analysts, security selectors, and independent thinkers. They manage a suite of niche investment funds with active, concentrated portfolios of value-based, occasionally contrarian investments. We invest in our funds too. You can learn more at penderfund.com.